Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 32 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks as they took on the St. Louis Blues and won by a score of 4-3. This was the final matchup between these two teams this season. The two previous ones, the Sharks lost both of them in post-regulation play, the first in overtime, the second in the shootout, so they were looking for a little bit of revenge here tonight, which they would end up getting with this regulation victory. This was also the sixth and final game of a large six-game road trip that the Sharks have been on these last couple of weeks, where they've had to face off against some pretty tough teams, and the Sharks have taken their beatings because of it, with some bad losses to the Tampa Bay Lightning and the Florida Panthers. But all in all, coming into this final game of the road trip, they have a semi-respectable 2-3 record. It doesn't look great, obviously, but considering the quality of competition, you can't really hate on it too much, especially since if they were to pick up this victory tonight against St. Louis, they'd end up with a 500 record on this road trip, a 3 victories and 3 defeats. And if you had told me 2 weeks ago coming into it that the Sharks would have a 3-3 split over this 6-game stretch, I'd actually be pretty satisfied with that. And so coming into this game, the major question yet again was what type of performance we'd get from the Sharks. They'd be going up against a slightly easier opponent than they have been used to over the last week. Then no Carolina, no Florida. This is a team on the outside looking in of the playoff picture. But at the same time, the Sharks, it would not have been surprised if they came out looking a little bit sluggish. They've had a ton of travel. This is the final game of the road trip. They've changed time zones multiple times, and they still remain as one of the teams with the most amount of games played this season. There hasn't been a lot of rest, and so if they were a bit slow, I don't think anybody would have really blinked an eye at that. But instead, the Sharks actually looked quite strong to start this game off. The first 40 minutes were in their favor, and they would even strike first just a couple of minutes into this game to make it 1-0 coming from Tyler Toffoli. But they would be unable to add to that lead in a really strong first period for themselves. Instead, St. Louis would get the game-tying goal, and it would be 1-1 after 20 minutes. In the second, while the Sharks would be a little bit worse, they would still be favored, I would say, in the middle frame, and they would score the only 2 goals of this period, both coming from noted St. Louis Blues killer Macklin Celebrini, including a rare San Jose Sharks power play goal that would put the Sharks up 3-1 with just 6 seconds to go in that second period, and so a 3-1 lead going into the third. But it was very important to remember at that point that back all the way in Game 1 of the regular season against this very same St. Louis Blues team, the Sharks had a 4-1 lead going into the third and would end up giving up 3 unanswered goals plus an overtime game winner to lose out on that game in the end. So the Sharks needed to take the lessons learned there and apply it to this game. And the first few minutes would go okay for them, kind of like how the start of the third period last game went against Carolina. But once Braden Shen scored here, the wheels did come off a little bit. Now, credit to the Sharks, they would get the eventual game winner from Jake Wallman, and while they would give up another goal to Jordan Kyrou, they would bend and not break. But still, the majority of this third period was played in their own defensive zone. But at the end of the day, they do manage to pick up the victory. They do get that little bit of revenge against St. Louis, and they end the road trip going back to San Jose on a pretty strong note. Now, before we get into the players to talk about, there is an extremely serious issue that we need to address of the utmost importance. One of those things that really makes you realize that there are bigger things in life than hockey, and that, of course, is the thing that the Sharks released yesterday, the Holiday Inflatables music video. Coming 10 years after the smash hit Holiday Sweater, the Sharks try and follow up on that with another big music video production here, and you can definitely tell that the Sharks, they went all out. Back in Holiday Sweater, it felt a little bit more kind of casual. The players who the Sharks brought in for it were some of the more bottom guys of the lineup, John Scott, James Shepard, Barclay Goodrow, these types of players. Here, this time around, the Sharks are bringing in the star power. They've got Zetterlund, they've got Eklund, they've got Celebrini, they've got Will Smith. They even bring in a couple of alumni in Joe Thornton and Patrick Marleau. They certainly went all out, and I'd say it paid off pretty well. This still ended up being an absolute banger of a song, but perhaps this is the nostalgia speaking to me. But I will say Holiday Sweater does edge it out slightly. While there were some great lines, some great verses in Holiday Inflatables, the big thing for me was the chorus. Holiday Sweater seems very, very catchy. I loved the beat, but Holiday Inflatables, it was kind of difficult at times to really discern what was being said in the chorus of this song. So it has a lot of things going for it, but I'm still definitely a little bit of a Holiday Sweater guy myself. Anyway, moving on to the things that, nobody really came here for. Obviously, everyone was here for the hard-hitting analysis of the music video. We move on now to the players to talk about from tonight's game. We start off with the Sharks' sort of top line, I guess you could consider them that or not, of Granlund, Zetterlund, and Klim Kostin. So the Lund line is broken up, which makes some sense because they were not very good in the previous game against Carolina, though I was very surprised to see it was Eklund getting dropped to that bottom line. Obviously, you can't really do it with Granlund because the center depth wouldn't really allow for it. You had to kind of choose one of these wingers, but if I had to choose, I would have definitely picked Zetterlund, who hasn't been that great over these last couple of weeks, and it feels as though he would maybe benefit a bit more from playing a bit deeper into the lineup compared to Eklund, who can thrive in a top line spot. But when it comes to this first line, they started the game off exceptionally well. Their first shift of the game, which would lead to this Tyler Toffoli goal, I thought was good, but then it was pretty much all downhill from there. We start off with Fabian Zetterlund. Now, you cannot say that this was like a lazy game from Zetterlund or that he wasn't fully engaged here. I liked the effort that we did see from him. It just didn't really lead to a lot of success on the ice. Zetterlund was losing a lot of these races for pucks. He was losing a lot of battles. When he would get the puck, it felt as though he was making the incorrect plays a lot of the times. There was a little bit of sort of unlucky puck bounces involved with some of the struggles that this line did have, but it felt as though almost every single time they would step on the ice, they were kind of hemmed into their own defensive zone, and I don't think Zetterlund really provided much of a spark to this. So again, going back to what I mentioned just a little bit earlier, if I was going to break up the Lund line, I would be putting someone like Zetterlund on that fourth line with Sturm and Dellandrea and having Eklund bump back up here. When it comes to Klim Kostin on the other side, Kostin continues to just be kind of unlucky in the sense of like injury related. It feels as though every single game now he's either taking a high stick to the face or blocking a shot that causes him to go down or taking a bad hit or getting some knee-on-knee contact. This time it finally catches up to him. He does not play the entirety of this third period. He leaves due to injury. We obviously do not know the severity of it, which is unfortunate though because Kostin has been playing pretty good though, kind of excluding here tonight. I don't think Kostin was great. This is mostly because I don't think the line itself was great, so it's not exactly Kostin's fault. So while he was still kind of like with Zetterlund, pretty engaged here tonight, he was being physical. We saw him actually draw a penalty, which is in stark contrast to him usually taking penalties for the Sharks. It just didn't really feel as though this line was generating much, and that kind of starts at the top with the center here, Mikael Granlund, who has been struggling as of late. I talked about how Eklund's snub from Team Sweden at the Four Nations tournament was perhaps leading to a slight drop in play, being a little bit disappointed. For Mikael Granlund, it's almost as though he made the team and so now he's just dropped off in play in general. I wasn't super impressed offensively with what Granlund was actually able to generate here tonight because he didn't really get much going. I will give him that in the third period he was improving somewhat defensively. He made a couple of clutch plays for the Sharks, but you kind of rely on this guy to score some goals. He is the Sharks' leading point scorer still, and these last couple of games just have not been very effective. Now, when it comes to the Sharks' second line, which may as well have been the first line here tonight, we have Celebrini with Toffoli and Nikolai Kovalenko. And we shall start off with Macklin Celebrini, who was lights out here tonight, absolutely. I mentioned earlier on that he's been a St. Louis Blues killer thus far this season. The Sharks have played 3 games against him. I believe he has 7 points over those 3 games, including 3 here tonight. He was all over the ice. Great play that would eventually lead to this Tyler Toffoli goal. A fantastic shot that would get the Sharks that rare power play one as well. And then on the 2-on-1 here, it's a bit of a lucky bounce, you could say, but still a good shot as well. And so you appreciate what Celebrini was able to do from an offensive perspective, but it's not just the points that he's putting up, but it is the plays that he's making as well. He probably could have had at least another goal, maybe another assist here on top of that. He's still easily gliding through the neutral zone. He's making defenders look very silly, trying to cover him, and yet he's just skating around them with ease. He's also getting back defensively. He's winning battles in that area. There were moments in which I wished Celebrini was able to make a better first pass out of the zone, but maybe you could just argue that he didn't really have a ton of support in those areas. But generally, the fact that he is playing down low, he is respecting that part of the game, and he's not cheating. It's something that we have seen thus far throughout this entire season for him, as he now hits the 20-game mark on the year. This was definitely one of his best games of the season, and he was definitely the Sharks' best player on the ice. But there was a close second, which was his line mate, Nikolai Kovalenko. Kovalenko came into the Sharks from that Blackwood trade last game against Carolina. He was put onto a fourth-line position, And while he was pretty good in that role, you obviously didn't really get much from him because he got less than 10 minutes of ice time around, something like that, in that particular game. But here he was given a massive opportunity, not only playing with a top 6 player like Tyler Toffoli, but also the most electric player on the Sharks, Macklin Celebrini, and he made the absolute most use of it as he possibly could. He picks up 3 assists here tonight. That is his first career 3-point game, which is not that much of a surprise considering he is a rookie playing in his first season in the NHL, and he was definitely playing some really smart hockey. There were a couple of those giveaways that we saw in that previous game against Carolina as well. He makes some risky passes, and he definitely doesn't have that same kind of like big boom moments, those shining moments like a Celebrini or an Eklund or a Granlund would have, but he's got some really sneaky passes, some great vision. He's passing these pucks in front of the net. He's setting up great chances. He probably also could have had an extra assist or 2 to go with the 3 he already did. He's also very hardworking on the forecheck. What I really appreciated, there was a play in the first period where the Sharks dump the puck into the zone, and it seems as though the Blues defenseman Justin Falk is just going to pick this one up, send it to his defensive partner, and it'll be an easy breakout for St. Louis, but Kovalenko goes right after him, and he gets enough on his stick that it causes Falk to hesitate a little bit, allows Kovalenko to tie him up, and he, with that support from the Sharks, wins that battle, and it creates a good offensive zone shift for San Jose. So it's also the little things that Kovalenko is managing to accomplish. He doesn't necessarily have the high highs of a Macklin Celebrini, very few players do, but he seems to actually have that strong innate offensive talent that could end up being a very useful top 9 player for the Sharks moving forward. The early returns on this trade are looking quite good. And then when it comes to Tyler Toffoli, I was also rather impressed with what Tyler Toffoli was able to do, and it's much more what you want to see from a Toffoli on a consistent basis this season, because he's had a lot of quiet games this year where he's not really doing much of anything. Here tonight, while it wasn't, again, like with Kovalenko, a lot of big standout moments, it felt as though he was doing a lot of little things, slowing the game down, allowing his teammates to catch up, still managing to use his patience to make a great pass. He was actually playing a very good defensive game as well. We saw him on the ice in the 6-on-5 situation, killing off the time for San Jose. Maybe it's a situation where he got stuck on the ice, but I wouldn't be surprised if Warsofsky sent him on purposely because he really looked locked in, I would say. So I was very much appreciative of what this second line, essentially the first line for the Sharks, was able to do. They were far and away the most effective group of players for the Sharks in this game. When it comes to the Sharks' third line, we have Wenberg and Goodrow and Cunnin. We'll start off with Luke Cunnin, who I thought had an extremely up and down game. I felt as though at the start he was one of the only players of this line, or really the only player of this line who was actually skating hard. I wasn't super impressed with what Wenberg and Goodrow were able to do from an offensive perspective, but Cunnin seemed to be able to bring that speed and energy and was actually making some good plays in the offensive zone. But then at the same time, you take a look at these 2 goals that the Sharks or the Blues would actually score in this third period. Both of them, Cunnin is not only on the ice for, but is actually the one losing defensive positioning, allowing these Blues players to get these goals. So Cunnin, I wasn't super impressed with his defensive play in the previous game against Carolina. The same would have to be said here tonight against St. Louis. So again, it's an up and down game, but for someone like Luke Cunnin, where maybe the offense isn't going to be absolutely flowing, though as of late he has been able to contribute a good bit, you want to be defensively responsible, and at times here tonight he really wasn't. When it comes to his 2 line mates, however, both Wenberg and Goodrow also pretty much had underwhelming games. Barclay Goodrow, I usually talk about how he just doesn't really provide anything offensively. A lot of times the play will die on his stick. He took that in this game and he turned it up to 11. Goodrow was just an offensive black hole. Now this isn't necessarily to say that Goodrow had a bad game. He actually made a couple of okay defensive plays, and all in all wasn't the worst player and the terrible performance that we have ever seen from the Sharks this season, but he wasn't really pushing the pace at all for San Jose either, and it was just kind of dead weight from an offensive perspective. So, as the Sharks will hopefully be getting healthier moving forward, depending on if Klim Kostin is out longer term or if Will Smith will be coming back soon since he's been on the injured reserve, hopefully Goodrow is the type of guy who's just going to sit there on the 4th line at best moving forward, compared to the start of the season when he was getting moments in the Sharks' top 6. And then when it comes to Alex Wenberg, like I said, a little bit of an underwhelming game, I would say, from Wenberg. His defensive game, which is usually rather solid, left a little bit to be desired here, especially in that third period, but I guess it wasn't the worst I've seen. And then when it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, this is where we have Sturm Dellandrea and William Eklund for some reason. As I mentioned earlier on, it didn't really make much sense for me for why Eklund was bumped down to the fourth after he had such a strong response to the benching in that first period against Carolina. But I thought here tonight Eklund did some good work. I thought he worked very hard. He set up some chances. The problem was it just felt as though mostly Dellandrea, Sturm as well was involved in this, but mostly Dellandrea was just not really in the correct position to actually capitalize on these opportunities. I don't really blame Dellandrea for it because he's not really used to playing with a player of Eklund's caliber on this line, but it made it so that while this fourth line was getting some offensive zone time, not much was happening. Now, to Eklund's credit, at the very least, and to Warsofsky's credit, this fourth line positioning didn't really last all that long. Eklund got multiple shifts upwards in the lineup, especially once Kostin went down with that injury. Eklund found himself on the ice many times over, so his ice time was far from the classic fourth liner below 10 minutes, but still, it was an odd decision from me from the get-go. When it comes to Ty Dellandrea, he had an interesting game, I guess. He gets into a fight pretty early on, then he ends up taking a penalty as well, a minor, so he spends most of the first period in the penalty box. When he eventually comes back in the second and third period, I thought he was all right, though not amazing. And then Nico Sturm, I thought, was a relatively average game for him as well. Then we get to the Sharks' defense, and we start off with the top pairing of Walman and Ceci. Now, Walman was a very interesting player to watch here tonight. It felt as though he was also, kind of like with Tyler Toffoli, extremely locked in here tonight, but that is not necessarily a positive thing. It felt as though Walman was playing an extremely aggressive game. He was trying to do a lot by himself. There were many moments in which he was making St. Louis Blues players look pretty silly, but then there were also many moments where he's trying to step up extremely aggressively and he gets burned, and then suddenly the Sharks are scrambling in their own zone. I know Walman, this is his former team, but it's kind of like twice removed in a way, in the sense that his actual former team was Detroit, and then St. Louis was his former team, so there might be some emotion there, but especially once Walman scored this goal, you could see there was like an explosion of energy in him. He seemed like really that he wanted to score this goal, so it did feel as though this game meant a little bit more for Walman, which meant that he was doing a lot more good, but also some bad as well. I would say mostly this was a positive game for Walman, and he actually sets a new career high in points in a much lower amount of games, so congratulations to him for that, but I'd like to see him rein it in a little bit. When it comes to his defensive partner, Cody Ceci, I actually really liked Ceci's performance here tonight. There were a couple of shifts in the third period where he did struggle a little bit in his own zone, but I don't put too much fault on him for that. Like I said, I thought Walman was trying to do a bit too much at times, and Ceci was struggling to respond in such a way. But in the first couple of periods, I really liked how active Cody Ceci was being in getting up into the rush play and actually pinching down in the offensive zone. It's something that we have occasionally seen from Ceci this season, but at times he's also making some incorrect choices when doing so. Here tonight, it felt as though a lot of the times he was making the right move, and so I was a big fan of what Cody Ceci was able to pull off here tonight. When it comes to the Sharks' second defensive pairing, we have Liljegren and Ferraro. This was a great start to this game for Timothy Liljegren. I thought through the first two periods, he was definitely the best offensive defenseman that the Sharks had here tonight. And, that is saying a lot, considering I mentioned Ceci was doing some decent things, and of course, Jake Walman exists as a player, but it felt as though Liljegren was all over it in those first 40 minutes. In the third period, when the Sharks were having to play more defensively, some of those weaknesses in Liljegren's game definitely did prop up, and he struggled at times in that area for sure. So it definitely wasn't a great game for him, but it was all right, and I appreciated the start he put up. Mario Ferraro, on the other hand, I thought there was mostly a struggle throughout the majority of this night. Obviously, the first couple of periods you didn't see it a ton because the Sharks were usually playing with the puck and doing some very good things with it. But when those few moments of defensive zone shifts in those first couple of periods for Ferraro weren't great, and then especially in the third period, I thought he struggled immensely. Not like a terrible game for Ferraro, but if I had to kind of rank all of the defensemen in order, Ferraro would probably be right at the bottom out of these six. And then when it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing, we have Ruda with Shakir Mukhamadullin. So he gets his first game of the season after he had picked up 3 games last year with the San Jose Sharks. He was expected to perhaps even start the season with San Jose, but unfortunately he goes through that injury during training camp and preseason that kind of really hurts a young player's chance of being able to make the roster, kind of like like what we saw from Thomas Bordeleau as well this year. So Mukhamadullin starts the year off with the Barracuda, and he has a bit of a slow start there, but he's been picking it up enough to end up earning this call-up. It's not as though Henry Thrun was playing all that consistent, so get someone who is also a left-handed defenseman up here. And Mukhamadullin, the messaging from the coaching staff seemed to be keep it simple, and keep it simple he definitely did. There really wasn't a lot to be excited about when it comes to Shakir Mukhamadullin. You didn't really get to see a lot of moments where you go, this guy's going to be like a star for the San Jose Sharks, but at the same time, you definitely can appreciate the steadiness that he did bring. He made some smart reads. There were a couple of moments where he stepped up in a good position in the neutral zone. He played a very, very risk-averse game, which was nice to see compared to like the very, very shakiness that we have seen from the guy who was replacing in the lineup, Henry Thrun. So I liked the general amount of minutes that Shakir Mukhamadullin put here tonight. There was that one shift in the third period where he got hemmed into his own zone for a couple of minutes. That was definitely his weakest shift of the game, but otherwise I thought he did some pretty good things. And it also in a way rubbed off onto Jan Ruda as well. Ruda maybe taking more of like the kind of experienced role here, bringing Mukhamadullin under his wing, and you simply can't do that if you're being as terrible as Ruda has been these last couple of games, and so he actually stepped up in a pretty big way. I thought Ruda was rather solid here tonight. And then finally, we have the Sharks goaltender Alexander Georgiev, the newest San Jose Shark. At least Kovalenko played in the previous game against Carolina. Georgiev, this is his first start with the team. And what I can definitely say going forward is that Georgiev is definitely going to give me some heart attacks watching him play. Kind of reminds me a little bit of Askarov, not in terms of the aggressiveness that Askarov has in terms of playing the puck, but with the way he just generally moves around the crease is very nerve-wracking. He feels a very, very kind of erratic goaltender, I would say. Definitely less calm and more composed than a Mackenzie Blackwood, or going back a few years to like a Martin Jones. But you could also see that there is some talent there. He made some pretty big saves, and while I would say one of these goals he probably would want back, the Jake Neighbors one, though it was a little bit tricky, the two goals he led in the third period he really didn't have much of a chance on, and he came up big for the San Jose Sharks down the stretch in the third, so you have to be at least somewhat appreciative of what he was able to do. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Saturday, where they'll be taking on the Utah Hockey Club. You have to appreciate what the Utah Hockey Club did for the Sharks earlier this season, back when San Jose had opened the year with 9 straight losses. Utah was the team that the Sharks picked up their first victory in, and that was the game in which the Sharks made the miraculous comeback and then won it in the overtime, and that has really just started this last stretch of games, this last month and a half for San Jose, where they've actually looked like a decent NHL hockey team. And so we shall see if the Sharks can go back to the point of where it all started and manage to pick up another victory there. Class dismissed.